Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some very smart talk radio is in your future, in this segment, no exception. Very happy to have William C. Davis. He is one of America's top Civil War historians. We have talked about the Civil War from time to time on this show, but very happy to revisit it again. He has authored more than 50 books and is a frequent historical consultant for television and film. He lives near Roanoke, Virginia. Some of my people's country, so to speak, from years and years ago. Brand new work, an important one, called Crucible of Command, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, the War They Fought and the Peace That They Forged. Mr. Davis, how are you, my friend?
Doing just fine, Warner. Thanks. Glad to be with you.
Well, I know that the Civil War, American history and the Civil War in particular, is close to your heart. I'm curious. There's a lot of books about Grant. There's a lot of books about Robert E. Lee. A lot of information about these guys. But why together? Why was that important to you?
Well, my interest really goes to the personal natures, the sort of the inner men. There have been a number of Grant and Lee joint biographies that mostly deal with them on the battlefield, which I certainly do to some extent. But my real interest was to look at their childhoods, their upbringing, the development of their ethical world, their moral compass, what they believed and why, and the experiences that molded them, all of which would go to inform the kinds of decisions that they made when they were given commands in the Civil War, and then to show how how their background, shall we say, kind of played itself out on the battlefields in which they met. But primarily, I'm interested in the inner men, which has not always been delved into that much with these fellows.
This is a big, broad question here that we could probably talk hours about, but just in general, the research that you've done over the years, and including with obviously what you did for this book, what was the primary thing they had in common, and what might be one big divisive difference that was between them?
I think I'd say the single biggest thing that they had in common, and that's what they have in common with virtually all great commanders, whether in the field of battle or in industry or anything else, is just that they were willing. They could take the big decision, put everything on the line, assume enormous risks, and go to sleep and get a good night's sleep. You know, Harry Truman, the night before the 1948 election, or Harry Truman after giving the decision to drop the bomb, it's that same sort of thing. They could take risks that others simply wouldn't. The biggest difference between them probably is their world outlook. Grant was an incurable optimist, in spite of all the times that he suffered failures, not all of which were his responsibility. Before the war, he always expected things to turn out right, whereas Lee gradually becomes more and more of a pessimist over the years as he is disillusioned with his career, with his marriage, with his station in life, and then with the destruction of the Union, to which he had been genuinely attached before 1861. So that there's a big emotional, psychological difference between the two.
There's no question, too, while Robert E. Lee was the general, so to speak, and the commander of the South, both of these men had tremendous love of country, did they not?
Oh, no question whatever. In fact, they both, some years before the war, were essentially kind of the same political ideology. They were both essentially Whigs, which today would be, somewhere a little left of center. They both believed in a strong central government. In Lee's case, because only a strong central government was going to protect the Army from the penny pinchers in Congress who wanted to do away with the professional Army. But in the case of both of them, because they felt a sincere emotional attachment to the Constitution, to its primacy above all other law and document, and to the Union itself. It's a degree of, I call it patriotism or whatever, that I think we don't see as much today, not because we're lesser people, but simply because our lives are vastly more complicated than theirs were, and we are drawn in far more directions than people were in their era. Patriotism was a very simple and basic thing to them.
Is it reasonable to assume that had they ever fought together on the same side, they would have been quite complimentary of one another and quite appreciative of one another?
I think so. Indeed, I may even make that comment in the book someplace. If the two had ever fought on the same side, they'd been just about invincible. They had the same attitude toward war, though they had some differing special skills at it. Grant was far better at, well, not far better, but he was better at logistics, at the planning of supply and material, the movement of men, getting everything ready to go into action. Lee arguably may have been better in the movement of men and artillery, etc., once on the field of battle. Lee was much more a hands-on commander, whereas Grant really was kind of a big-picture fellow who easily delegated, set his plans, and then trusted his subordinates to carry them out. Lee was always a little unwilling to give full latitude to his subordinates.
They both arrived, though, at their various positions through quite different ways, did they not? Their path was quite different.
Yeah. Lee's would be the expected path, of course. He's from one of the first families of Virginia. By 1861, Lee's been in the Army for 32 years. He's had a pretty good rise in responsibility and in rank, though it's slow, as it always was in the peacetime Army. But by 1861, he's a colonel commanding a regiment, which is a goal to which most officers never had a chance of reaching. It would have been unusual if Lee had not become the first soldier of his republic, at least in peacetime and certainly in war. Grant, of course, as you know, left the Army about 6 years after the end of the war with Mexico. He was stationed out on the Pacific coast and tried a variety of business ventures that failed, got tired of being alone and isolated away from his family, and simply resigned, and then went again through one business failure after another until the war came. He was just kind of an available man to come back into uniform as a colonel to whip into shape an unruly Illinois regiment. And thereafter, he was just in the right place at the right time, backed by the right politicians to get some promotion, more responsibility, and then demonstrate what he could do. So they came by radically different routes to the same end. And interestingly, which most people don't realize, Grant was a war hero before Lee was. Grant takes Fort Donelson in February 1862 and opens up the entire southern heartland to invasion. He wins the Battle of Shiloh in April. And in April 1862, Lee is still a desk soldier in Richmond. He hasn't gotten his chance yet.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to follow up with was how aware, if at all, were each other of each other's exploits before they were both put into command?
They rarely, if ever, speak of each other until they actually confront each other in the spring of 1864. I think during the Vicksburg campaign in June of 63, Lee makes one or two references to what impact there will be if this fellow Grant is successful, what impact there would be on the Eastern theater of war. Grant, I don't recall actually mentioning Lee much at all until the winter of 1863-64, when he comes east and is made overall commander of Union armies. But he certainly understands, from the time of Vicksburg, if not before, that if he's successful in the West, he is inevitably going to have to come up against Lee at some point because he's the Union's most successful commander. There's a public outcry wanting Grant to come east. The Union's winning the war almost from the beginning out west of the Appalachians, but in the east, it's continually stymied by Lee. So public demand, if nothing else, is going to insist that their greatest commander, Grant, be sent to do something about the Confederacy's greatest commander, Lee.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In this segment, got a good one going here. We're talking about a brand new work called Crucible of Command. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, the war they fought and the peace they forged, penned by William C. Davis, well known, one of America's top Civil War historians. He's authored and edited more than 50 books, frequent consultant for television and film. lives upon the land of which he writes in Virginia. And William, I'm curious also. Would these men, given a choice, would they have tried to ascend to these positions, or again, was this time and place, and they accepted it simply as an act of duty?
It's pretty much time and place, and especially in Lee's case, duty. Lee didn't want secession. He certainly didn't want war. Even after he's become a Confederate officer, he still appears to harbor some hopes that some kind of peaceful accommodation might take place between North and South that would allow reunion short of a long and bloody war. He even once the war is well underway, he constantly speaks of wanting it to be over and wanting no longer to have to do what he is doing. By the mid part of the war, he actually talks about wishing he could just be a farmer, even though Lee had hated farming the one time he tried to run a plantation. Grant, his viewpoint from the first is, this is a bad job. We need to get into it and get it done and get it over as quickly as possible to minimize the damage done spiritually and psychologically to both North and South, so the Union can go on being a great single nation. Neither of them, so far as I could tell, saw anything relating to ambition or their own self-interest in their rises. Grant certainly was happy that he was finally making good money and was being very successful, but he still always spoke of, if we can just end the war with one more campaign.
You know, I think it is maybe better known a little bit more about Lee, that he came from, I think without question, you would consider it some level of aristocracy. What about Ulysses Grant?
It's an interesting comparison. The Lees are among the first, the FFVs, the first families of Virginia. There have been Lees in Virginia for 100 years before there was the United States, so you can understand his allegiance to Virginia. His father is Light Horse Harry Lee, and who was a hero of the Revolution, though he fell on hard times. And so as a result, Lee grew up in a household with no father. Grant was part of a sort of rude frontier aristocracy. His father, Jesse Grant, was the wealthiest man in their little town in Georgetown, Ohio. A prominent businessman. He was a complete jackass otherwise. No one liked him. And he was a difficult father in many ways. But Grant grew up never knowing want. He was always well-fed, well-clothed, well-educated, and really had a fairly idyllic childhood, whereas Lee had an awful lot of responsibility thrust on him from an early age as the oldest son, essentially helping to look after his widowed mother and his family. Grant, bad as his father could be, he gave his children enormous leeway, which allowed Grant to do a great deal at an early age that even children today wouldn't be allowed to do. By the time he was 17, by my calculation, Grant had traveled by himself between 1,500 and 2,000 miles, all around Ohio, western Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, taking goods for his father's firm, but also just gaining life experiences from the road. And that had a tremendous eye-opening impact on him, I think, in widening his worldview, an interest he maintained all his life. After he left the White House, he would be the first American president to travel overseas, and he spent 2 years traveling all around the world.
Here's one for you. Put Robert E. Lee in charge of the Northern forces, put Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the South. Any differences at all? Any outcome any different? How would that have changed?
Well, these historians always try to beg off on counterfactual questions like that. but that's because we're all chicken. It's okay. But I think, in fact, there'd be no ultimate change because there are factors beyond just generals commanding armies. Most historians would agree that as long as Abraham Lincoln was president, and as long as the people of the North continued to be willing to pay the price in blood and treasure to prosecute the war, then sooner or later the Confederacy was going to be defeated. No European nations had shown any interest in coming to the aid or support of the Confederacy. It got no diplomatic recognition. It got no military aid or assistance. And sooner or later, if by nothing other than just attrition, the North was going to wear it down. And I don't really see that Lee is going to win any colossal victories that would, or colossal defeats that would change that, or that Grant would win any, epochal victories that would somehow tell the North to give up and stop fighting. It really comes down to Lincoln and the determination of the Northern people.
Do you believe that over the course of the war, my sense is this, that the respect that each man had for one another grew probably throughout the war?
There's very little on which to base that. I have a notion that Grant certainly had some respect for Lee's capabilities as a commander. They didn't know each other personally, of course. They'd only met a couple of times during the war with Mexico. They had not been friends in the old army. It's hard to say what Lee felt of Grant. He does give kind of a backhanded compliment once when he describes Grant as being tricky, a man who will try to surprise us. So he's paid some attention to the way Grant has conducted his campaigns. The few expressions we have from either of them are mostly post-war, and they're very interesting. Grant will say Lee was a good general, but he wasn't their best by any means. And Lee would say, Grant was an okay general, but he really thought George McClellan was a better general. Both are nonsense. McClellan was a horrible general. He didn't have that vital element, that willingness. But I think what it says a lot about the two men as human beings. Lee always beat McClellan. So if McClellan was the best Union commander, then Lee always beat the best. Grant, I think, felt so kind of overshadowed by the already emerging Lee myth in 1865 that he didn't want to acknowledge that Lee, in fact, was the best general he had faced. So they both go to their graves kind of denying that each had met in the other his foremost combatant.
Here's one. We're a little bit off the path a little bit, but from your perspective as a historian, was the Civil War inevitable, or could there have been measures taken to avoid it? Were there some strategies not tried, diplomacy, etc., legislative, etc.? And as a result, what was its fundamental change in terms of the entire American psyche and how the country developed?
Well, in the next hour and a half, I'll answer that question. No, I don't think it's inevitable. There are some problems, and if you look at our world today, you can see there are some problems that are apparently beyond compromise. Abortion, gun control, nuclear armament, that sort of thing. I mean, people will get violent rather than compromise on those issues. And this issue of it's not state rights versus federal rights. It essentially comes down to the issue of whether or not there are going to be any more slave states. If there can't be any more slave states, which is the northern position, then inevitably the existing slave states will be an increasing minority in Congress, especially in the Senate, and that at some point might open up the possibility that the northern states would be able to pass legislation abolishing slavery where it existed, which posed a mortal threat to the whole Southern society and economy. You imagine if today someone were to propose that we would abolish the Internet or abolish the internal combustion engine on all automobiles, or abolish home ownership. People might very well rise up because of the personal threat to them. I don't know how you could compromise on that. Southerners did ask that if they could just have a compromise guaranteeing the right to take slaves to the territories, then they'd be willing to back away from secession. But that, of course, essentially gave the whole game to the South from the northern point of view. It was an era where there really were no good statesmen, and we all know what that's like. Every 20 years, the country seems to go through that. The days of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were done, and there were no great compromisers who had the personal prestige to craft some kind of a compromise, though men did try. It didn't necessarily have to come to blows, but it was almost inevitable, I think, that it would. And once it had, when the war was over, well, it certainly defined the relation of the states to the federal government. The states were incontestably subordinate to the federal government, which would remain primary and does, of course, to this day, though we still occasionally have outbreaks of efforts to sort of stand up for state rights of one kind or another versus the federal government. You know, the word union went out of the vocabulary and it now became United States.
You mentioned, that the outcomes, regardless of who was leading these armies, because of some resources and circumstances, probably it was inevitable that the North would eventually win. I'm curious, from your research, did Robert E. Lee ever write or speak of regrets of how he led the South, or things he might have done differently, or was he that reflective on it?
Lee always maintained a pose, and I think it's probably genuine, of humility regarding his own capabilities as a general. He does, of course, he makes probably a sincere effort to resign after the Gettysburg campaign, asking Jefferson Davis to give the command to someone who's more capable. I don't think Lee believed there was anybody in the South who was more capable, but I don't think he ever accepted the inevitability of defeat, though the longer the war went, and especially after mid-1864, he began to raise the ultimate possibility of defeat if the Confederacy did not do this or did not do that. As for regrets about his own leadership, I don't think so. He far less than most generals of that war, he doesn't do a lot of self-justification after the fact of blaming his defeats on somebody else, that sort of thing. But he does, at least with Antietam and with Gettysburg, imply in his last years, in private conversation, never for publication, that some of his generals let him down. So he has regrets about that, but there's nothing contained in those comments that suggests he would have done something in a different fashion.
During the period of surrender and the period after the war, what kind of a relationship did Grant and Lee have?
Well, during the surrender itself, they both conducted themselves as if the eyes of the world were on them, which, of course, they were. Lee is the personification of dignity. He shows no contrition in defeat, but neither is he combative or aggressive. Grant gives no indication whatever of exultation or glorying in defeat. He's obsessed by concern, as he admits himself, for the feelings of the defeated foe. Shortly after the surrender, he gives orders that his armies not to celebrate by firing cannon salutes and that sort of thing that might further embarrass or humiliate the defeated Confederates. So they conduct themselves in a model fashion during the surrender, the negotiation itself on April 9th. They meet again the next day. No one has given us an account of what they talked about. They sat on their horses between the lines for about half an hour. Grant did say that he was hoping to get Lee to go beyond just surrendering his own army, and as General-in-Chief of the Confederate armies, to surrender all of them, believing that that would end the carnage sooner, and the less blood was shed, the less treasure was spent, the easier it would be for the two sides to reunite. Lee had shown, prior to Appomattox, some inclination to perhaps be willing to do that, but then he changed his mind, and I can't say why. But he does not go along with what Grant proposes, and they don't meet again for another 3 years. Grant's a little disappointed with the way Lee conducts himself after the war. Lee's dignified. He universally advises all Confederates to accept the result, to go home, go to work, start rebuilding themselves, and rebuild the South, accept the results of the war. But but there's a little air of grudgingness about it, and Grant was irritated at that. He thought Lee could have done a lot more to bring about a more complete and a quicker reconciliation. They meet one last time in the White House within weeks after Grant takes office. As president, he gets a message to Lee that he would be happy to see him should Lee come pay a visit. And Lee did, in fact, come see him, and they talked again for something less than an hour. And again, Grant kind of pressed Lee to speak out in favor of reconciliation, so that something short of what would become the Reconstruction measures that were later so divisive in the South. And again, Lee said essentially that he had no real influence and really couldn't do that. And that's it. I think there was respect, but there was never, say, affection or warm friendship, as there was between a number of other pairs of former Union and Confederate generals.
Right. The work is Crucible of Command, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, The War They Fought, The Peace They Forged, authored by William C. Davis, an author of more than 50 books. Over time, a consultant to the History Channel and much other well-respected author on numerous topics in American history. Published by DeCapo Press. William, how can people get a copy of the book and find out more about the work that you do?
Well, it's actually, I think today is its on-sale date, so it should be in the bookstores now. I think all the Barnes & Nobles are carrying it. History Book Club and Military Book Club will be offering it as their main selections later this month. And, of course, Amazon and all the other usual Internet channels will have it available. So it shouldn't be hard to find. It's a big, fat book of about 600 and some pages, and if you don't enjoy reading it, it'll make a wonderful doorstop.
Yeah, it's light reading for the beach, for sure. No, it's a very important work indeed. What before we close out here, real quickly, what's your plan for the next work?
Well, I'm working on a bizarre character. We don't know what her name was. She operated under a bunch of aliases. We know relatively little about her, but she's known to history as Loretta Velasquez, who claimed to have posed as a man and served in the Confederate Army as Lieutenant Harry Buford, which she certainly did not. She's the first Confederate media celebrity, and after the war spends 50 years being an unrecalcitrant con artist, trying one huge con after another. She's a remarkable person, but it's tough to pin her down.
Sounds like a reality show. It should be a good one. Well, listen, thank you so much for spending time with us. We'd love to have you back on again.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.